There are two things I want to say fairly early on in this video. The first being that we've already encountered some concerns from organizations who want to do some stakeholder engagement, but they don't really know where to start, and they can already anticipate the problems with sending out very generic, unspecific requests to potentially large numbers of stakeholders, knowing that in most cases the stakeholders lack the technical expertise and background to provide the kind of information that the ESRS looks for when we're talking about engagement and due diligence in particular. The second is there has also been quite a lot of noise in social media about the applicability of some of the moves that have already started happening with respect to stakeholder engagement. And I would recommend looking at a couple of the posts from Felipe Diaz. He has posted a couple of real-world examples of some of the early surveys or some of the early stakeholder engagement moves that have been made. And he's quite critical about these, and I think he's critical about them with very good reason, that these tend to be non-targeted, they tend to not provide necessary background information, sometimes there's inexplicable pre-filtering occurring, and various other reasons why Felipe in particular finds some of these approaches, let's say, more than problematic. So we have a situation where the market is starting to question how stakeholder engagement should be happening and has been happening. And we also have companies themselves recognizing that how they engage stakeholders, how they collect the information they need is not trivial. And some of the methods that are being suggested and proposed are rather less effective than you might be led to believe at first thought. So in order to kind of explore this in a bit more detail, we're going to start with looking at what is the purpose of stakeholder engagement, what are we trying to achieve with it, and how can we scope it appropriately. Let's begin then by consulting the ESRS itself. If we're going to talk about stakeholder engagement in the context of the ESRS, then we need to know what the ESRS says about it. And one of the first places we would go to is the double materiality section of ESRS 1, and then even more specifically, the section of ESRS 1 which explicitly tells us what a stakeholder is and how they are relevant to the process. So we could probably just stop here, to be honest, but we will obviously go into more detail and make some more judgments. But this is certainly the best place to start. And if there's only one thing you're going to read, this is where I would direct your attention. First of all, stakeholders. What is a stakeholder? In the context of the ESRS, they are those who can affect or be affected by the undertaking. So these are organizations, individuals, or natural environments who can affect your undertaking or who are potentially or actually affected by the undertaking. And there are two main categories. They are affected stakeholders. So these are the second group here, affected by the undertaking. And these are individuals or groups whose interests are or could be affected, both positively and negatively. And then there are the users of the sustainability statements, those organizations and individuals who will read your sustainability statements. Logically, then, these are those who can affect your organization. They are reading your sustainability information and then they are having some effect on you as a result of that. Affected stakeholders is one I want you to remember because we're going to keep coming back to the same group. A stakeholder may belong to both groups, so there may be some organizations who are in both camps. Then we talk about straight away engagement. First of all, engagement is central to the ongoing due diligence process. So this is not a one-off thing, it is an ongoing thing, and it is the due diligence process, which we'll talk about in a few seconds, and the materiality assessment. So the stakeholder has two roles: ongoing due diligence and materiality assessment. Let's not forget those two components here. This includes the process to identify and assess actual and potential negative impacts. Note the deliberate insertion of negative impacts here. So, a quick sort of summary with a little bit of interpretation from me laid over the top. We have affected stakeholders and stakeholders who affect. In the context of due diligence and sustainability materiality, engagement is critical, and there is an explicit mention in the ESRS about negative impacts and identifying material impacts. So we can start drawing already some implication that stakeholder engagement would target, in particular, affected stakeholders and negatively impacted stakeholders. It is not explicit here that the stakeholders you must engage are just those who are negatively impacted. However, it does give us a clue about the relevance and the intent of the stakeholder engagement. There seems to be a primary intent here to engage stakeholders who are negatively impacted. Let's jump ahead now to the application requirements, which also reference or apply to double materiality. And here we can see further reinforcing of that same concept. There are some common categories. So these are typical categories of stakeholders: employees, suppliers, consumers, end users, customers. So this gives us some idea about the scope of the types of groups which are typically stakeholders or commonly stakeholders. And then we have explicit mention of nature as the silent stakeholder. And here's the critical bit which we need to think about. Materiality assessment. So with respect to the materiality assessment, this is informed by dialogue with affected stakeholders. This is reinforcing the same point again. The stakeholders that we want to engage, at least with respect to materiality assessment, are those who are affected. That's pretty explicit here. Along with the users of the reporting to provide inputs or feedback on the conclusions. We're starting to get a bit more of a picture here. Engaging the stakeholders who are negatively affected or are affected, and getting feedback on the conclusions regarding IROs. So we would be drawing some conclusions first and then getting some validation or some feedback from some stakeholders. Now we're going to jump forward to reporting, because the information that you are expected to report in your sustainability statement with respect to stakeholder engagement can also tell you where you should be focusing your efforts. So this is SBM2, and this is the disclosure requirement for disclosing the interests and views of stakeholders. We are expected to disclose how the interests and views of stakeholders are taken into account by the company's strategy and business model. So how does the overall company's strategy and business model take account of these views? This does not say that you must engage stakeholders in order to gather those views. All it says is, how do you take account of those views? And this is talking about at the strategic and business model level. This is not talking about minor incidental account. This is a very fundamental thing to your business model, a very high level, high threshold requirement. In particular, the disclosure should summarize these things. This is paragraph 45A. We should summarize the engagement, including the key stakeholders. So this is important to note. We will be reporting in the sustainability statement the engagement with key stakeholders. So we're going to have to find out what a key stakeholder is at some point. Whether engagement occurred, which indicates that it is not necessary to engage. What is necessary is to disclose how the interest and views were taken into account. What we are interested in is the views and the interests of the stakeholders, not necessarily engaging them. If you already know their views and you have documented that, you don't actually need to engage them. It's not a requirement, but you do need to discuss or disclose whether you engaged with them and how this occurred. How did you organize the engagement? What was the purpose of the engagement? And how did you take this into account in the organization? So once again, we have a bit more scoping here. We know now what we will be required to disclose when it comes to writing the sustainability statement. And now we have this concept of a key stakeholder, which we can add to our existing understanding from the double materiality, DRs and ARs, which seems to suggest that stakeholder engagement, at least for double materiality, is about affected stakeholders. And here we are now adding the concept of a key stakeholder. So we're kind of building up this refined and targeted scope of the stakeholders we should be engaging with, and then thinking about the purpose of that engagement and the disclosure of that engagement. What is the ESRS interested in with respect to the stuff we publicly disclose? So I'm jumping backwards and forwards quite a lot through the ESRS here. Now I'm jumping back to ESRS 1, the due diligence section. And we know already that stakeholders are central to due diligence. We read that before. So now we need to understand what is due diligence. Paragraph 59, section 4 of ESRS 1 tells us that due diligence is the process by which an undertaking identifies, prevents, mitigates, and accounts for how they address actual and potential negative impacts. So due diligence is exclusively concerned with negative impacts. And it is the identification process, and then it is all the actions that occur subsequent to identifying a negative impact. Now, if stakeholder engagement is central to due diligence, which we learned before, then we must take account of stakeholder views specifically with relation to negative impacts. So we're now getting the scope from all the possible stakeholders that might exist, the different types of stakeholders, knowing that affected stakeholders are a focus, and then at least as far as due diligence is concerned, it is negatively impacted stakeholders. Now, we could already draw the conclusion that the minimum kind of definition then of a key stakeholder would be those who are negatively impacted. And this is being drawn from repeated references and repeated insinuation that this is the case in the ESRS. Now, as I said before, it doesn't explicitly say this. I am inferring this, that the process of scoping down stakeholders should rather focus on negatively affected stakeholders. But I am inferring this from multiple references inside the ESRS. It is not explicitly stated to be the case. Now that we've looked at a few of the critical ESRS passages, let's take a look at the next informative document for double materiality in particular, and that is the IG1 Materiality Assessment Guidance, issued in December 2023, still in draft form. And we're going to go through and look at a number of the ways it describes and provides guidance on the concept of engagement. So we have quite early on a paragraph which is in the very first sort of section. So this is a summary of the entire guidance document. And it says this: engagement with affected stakeholders, note that this is engagement with those who are affected, should inform the materiality process. Right? That includes that this engagement occurs at some point prior to the conclusion of double materiality. And it entails seeking input and feedback in order to understand concerns and evidence about actual and potential impacts. Now, given that the word concern is raised here, this also indicates we are talking about negatively affected stakeholders. Although there may be concerns about the overstatement of positive impacts, it's much more likely that this is referring to negatively affected stakeholders. Note that this last section here is really explicit. The ESRS does not mandate specific behavior on stakeholder engagement. So anyone that tells you there is a specific way you must conduct engagement, especially if that is an auditor, has not read this document. The ESRS does not tell you exactly how you must engage stakeholders. It simply asks you to be transparent about whether you did, how you did, and what came of that engagement. Moving on to para 69 of the same document, there is a section relating to the understanding of affected stakeholders. And it is in the context of affected stakeholders where we see key stakeholder mentioned again. So here we are talking about key affected stakeholders, and it lists some of the ways you can try to identify such stakeholders. These are just aids and suggestions. Once again, we're bumping into this concept that the stakeholder engagement is about affected stakeholders. Then we start moving on to some of the real meat in this guidance document. The purpose of engagement with key stakeholders is to help understand how they may be impacted. So there it is. The idea of engagement with key stakeholders is to understand how they may be impacted. It is about impacted or affected stakeholders, and it may help assess the severity and likelihood of impacts. You'll notice that severity is the test inside negative impacts. Severity applies to negative impacts. So once again, we're reinforcing that same message that key stakeholders are probably those who are negatively impacted in some way. Let's keep going. Now we move on to the role and approach to stakeholders in the assessment process. Here we find out, or it is reiterated, that there are two groups of stakeholders, those who are affected and those who read the sustainability statement. And there is the explicit acknowledgement here that the transparency that is required in order for reporting is the consultation with affected stakeholders. Once again, the ESRS does not mandate behaviour, but this is the statement I made earlier. You are required to disclose whether and how the assessment process identifies and assesses impacts, including how stakeholders contribute to that. So stakeholders are involved in identifying impacts in some way and assessing them in some way. That's what it wants you to disclose. Okay, I'm going to stop pushing this line of thought in just a second because, in my opinion, it is so consistent throughout the documents, even though this is not explicitly stated anywhere, that we can draw a conclusion that key stakeholders are those who are negatively impacted. Here's paragraph 103. Engaging, for example, consulting with affected stakeholders and incorporating their views into the materiality assessment helps to substantiate their perspective when determining the relevance of sustainability matters to them. And here we go. For example, this includes engaging with the undertaking's employees and their representatives on health and safety matters. So here we see that the ESRS is encouraging us to engage a stakeholder with context, with the specific issues that they are likely to be affected by. This is not simply spamming stakeholders with everything and asking them to effectively sort through it and filter all of those different sustainability matters. We should be, in theory, already presenting them with a concept or an idea of how we think they might be affected, and then involving them in the identification and assessment process. I've mapped out a basic schematic of what we've been talking about so far. In this little diagram here, I've got the undertaking and its stakeholders. And at the top of these two circles, we can see the negative and positive impacts going from left to right. This is where the undertaking is affecting a stakeholder. And at the bottom, we've got the blue arrow representing the stakeholders who have an interest in the sustainability information of the undertaking. What I'm suggesting here is that the negatively affected stakeholders is arguably the group of stakeholders that we can consider to be key stakeholders, at least in the first instance, and that there is an initial mapping of impacts and affected interests that could occur. This need not be the entire assessment, but you're looking at probable, potential, likely impacts, trying to match those to specific interests, and then looking at those interests that have stakeholders behind them where there is a negative impact relationship. At that point, looking to engage those stakeholders to get more information, to validate your assessment, and that, I think, forms the key part of key stakeholder engagement. Then we could move on to the risk and opportunities part of the engagement, the latter phase. And this might be where you would select a couple of important investors or business relationships where you have identified potential risks or opportunities and where you think it is worthwhile having some validation. Notice that in both cases here, we are talking about validating and confirming information that you have already gathered or conclusions that you are already about to make, and involving your stakeholders on a targeted basis on those topics. This is not simply spamming everybody and trying to get a random assortment of unqualified information back from your stakeholders. You'll also note that this diagram looks very similar to the double materiality visualizations, where you have an undertaking, the wider environment, the effect of the undertaking on the environment, and then you have the effect of the wider environment back on the undertaking. That is the way the environment presents risks and opportunities for the business. So I think dealing with stakeholders in this way and focusing on the key stakeholders also then maps to the kind of overall way that double materiality is intended to occur. Here's a diagram I've put together over the past 3 or 4 months, possibly longer, with my colleagues at Code Gaia, which attempts to map out the entire double materiality process. This started off as a simple 3/4-step process. We initially thought we could simplify this down, we could explain double materiality in a few basic steps, and we thought we could kind of talk or encourage clients and companies through this process in a simplistic 3 to 4 step manner. Now, I know that a lot of companies are asking for this. They're saying, tell me how to do double materiality in 4 or 5 steps. And I know a lot of people are selling this. Double materiality made easy, double materiality in 3 steps, 4 steps to double materiality. Unfortunately, as you can see from this diagram, my experience over the last 6 months, both reading the standard, reading the guidance documents, and now conducting many real life examples of double materiality analysis, has led me and my colleagues to believe that this process is far more iterative than this kind of 3/4 step approach. So I'll explain this diagram and we'll start with the color scheme. So the dark blue ones are those steps which we think to be key kind of steps, key process steps within double materiality. The grey are the iterative relationships between some of those key process steps and between some of the definitions that have to be drafted. Then we have the light blue sections, which are the key documentation sections or the key processes which you should document and have good written records, particularly for assurance. And then there's the green step, which is voluntary, where we recommend in many cases that you seek assurance of your process. So now let's go into a bit more detail about exactly what's going on here, remembering that the purpose of this video is to talk about how we can focus stakeholder engagement. So starting at the left, as most of these diagrams tend to go left to right, we typically recommend, and I think it makes sense, to have a briefing or an initial kickoff meeting where the key involved parties, particularly with respect to reporting and possibly data gathering, are together and you talk about double materiality and you talk about report production. That process should probably outline the entirety of what double materiality is going to do and then have some sort of down the path or end game notes on what it is this whole reporting process is designed to achieve. Very early on then, you can see the grey indicators down the bottom. We recommend that you should start defining the value chain scope or the value chain definition and the business model definition that you will apply through double materiality and you will describe during reporting. Also note that this set or this pair of definitions will be updated throughout the process. So it doesn't just get drafted at the beginning and then left. It will be something that iterates as you go through double materiality. So after a briefing, then we are moving into an initial mapping or identification of stakeholders. There are some recommended groups of stakeholders that are in the ESRS guidance papers. And you may also want to include stakeholders that you have already engaged in the past, drawing on existing company documentation. So we are identifying the initial sets or groups of stakeholders, and we may choose to start some early engagement. Remembering that we don't want to be spamming people unnecessarily, which is why we then recommend moving fairly quickly onto identification and assessment of impacts, and then iterating that identification back into the stakeholder groups. So this is what we were talking about before in the video, with the engagement of negatively affected stakeholders being somehow key to this whole process. And so you want to be identifying and assessing some impacts at some point in order to know at least if they are negative and who the stakeholders are before you engage those key stakeholders. So noting that we're documenting these processes and these decisions as we go, and then we would move on after the identification and assessment of impacts onto the identification and assessment of financial risks and opportunities. Once again, noting that this is iterative, because as you are identifying and assessing impacts, you may identify risks and opportunities which are related in some way. And when you go on to formally identifying risks and opportunities, you may then become more aware of impacts which you were not aware of previously. So those two things then become iterative. And of course, the result of identifying new impacts may result in new stakeholders, which may result in new engagement. So then we end up stepping right back to the engagement part or the stakeholder identification part of this process. There's also the question then of whether we want to engage any of our stakeholders with respect to the validation of risks and opportunities. And obviously, investors would be one of the key groups here where we may choose to engage certain key investors. So that is why we then have this sort of in and out process from the financial risks and opportunities up to our engagement. Engagement in this diagram is split into two parts. There is the key stakeholder active engagement. So these are the stakeholders that we've talked about earlier in this video. We've identified specific risks, opportunities, or impacts that we want to engage them on. We want to validate, we want to understand their interests, and we want to understand how they may be affected. And there's passive engagement, and this is more of an open door policy, where if a stakeholder did come to us with information or with their interests, their opinions, we could then take them into account, but we wouldn't be actively seeking engagement with them. We would certainly not turn them away if they came to us. So then moving right through to the final stages of this process, at some point we would have to understand internally or agree that we have come as far as we can. We are comfortable with quality and scope of IROs we've identified. So at some point you're going to want to close out on double materiality, noting that it probably should be an ongoing process in reality. And then we would want to gather all our documentation together. We would want to have our final list of IROs which are material, and possibly, at least for audit purposes, the list of IROs that were assessed and found to be not material and why, and then tie all this documentation up and send it to a qualified party for some kind of assurance. Now, this is voluntary. You don't have to have double materiality assured. It is the sustainability statement that should be, according to the standard, assured, but I think it makes good sense in light of best practice to also have some sort of external validation of the double materiality process, especially if you are not reporting voluntarily. Once again, reminder that we would want to have a final value chain and business model definition at some point towards the end of the double materiality process, because these definitions will then be needed in the sustainability statement. And at this point, we should know what our topics and issues for reporting are, our sustainability matters, and the full set of material IROs. So there we go. That is the pretty complicated version of double materiality, and I think this is a fairly realistic way of displaying and visualizing this whole process. And as I mentioned at the start of this diagram, it is kind of difficult to continue promoting these very simplified understandings of double materiality, particularly those that do not recognize the iterative nature of much of this whole process. Okay then, so tying it back to the purpose of this video, which is to avoid spamming stakeholders. As you can see from this, I think having this iterative process in mind and really understanding the purpose of engagement will help avoid that spam situation. So thanks for watching this video. This will close out this one. I hope people are getting value from this channel. It's very new, and I think I'm going to continue producing content like this. So yeah, feel free to engage in the comments and look out for the next video.